But the best way for me to help everyone is to bring inflation down, as I'm determined to do. Right. And that requires me to make some decisions, whether it's on public sector pay.
How hard would it be to point out that after more than a decade of almost completely unprecedented wage stagnation, workers in the UK are £11,000 a year worse off? How about pointing out that 2022 was the worst year for real wage growth in nearly half a century? That average real wages in the UK will actually be lower in 2026 than they were in 2008? And how about then asking the Prime Minister on what planet can it be said wage rises for public sector workers are causing high inflation? And while you're at it, you could also point out that according to the International Monetary Fund, it was rising corporate profits which were the largest contributor to Europe's inflation over the past 2 years as companies increased prices by more than the spiking costs of imported energy. So just when the Prime Minister should be targeting corporate greed, his shameless government once again puts the burden on the backs of working people by imposing yet another crappy real terms pay cut on them. And to get away with it, he shamelessly uses a justification which has been rubbished over and over again by expert economists.
Inflation is coming down, and I think I think people can see light at the end of the tunnel.
Inflation in June was almost 8%. And imagine the Prime Minister's shock when he finds out food price inflation in July was more than 13%. 2 million adults in the UK, many of them in work, can't even afford to eat every day. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister thinks imposing another crappy real terms pay cut on public sector workers is
a fair deal for workers.
And before anyone starts shouting, look at the Eurozone.
For families up and down the country, prices are still rising much too fast. There's a long way to go. If we look at inflation at 3% in the US, 5.5% in the Eurozone.
So why is the UK faring so badly when compared to the US and the Eurozone? Here is Energy Secretary Grant Shapps with one of the answers.
The UK is an outlier. In continental Europe, in the United States, inflation is much lower. Interest rates are much lower. Why are we such an outlier?
So we have a combination of very low unemployment, lower than the EU average in most European countries, which gives you a tight labour market.
It's an extraordinary admission of the failure of the government's immigration policy since the UK left the European Union. Post-Brexit labour shortages are now actually driving up inflation.
We have got people queuing up to come to this country to pick crops that are rotting in fields, to work in warehouses that otherwise wouldn't be operable, and we're not letting them in.
And the government's answer to this is let's make it even harder for people from the European Union to come here to work. Using the words of the Prime Minister, it's
complete economic illiteracy.
We've accepted recommendations from independent pay review bodies.
Well, of course he has. They've just recommended another crappy real terms pay cut.
Inflation is what is eating into people's pockets. It's into their pay packets, into their savings. That's why inflation is so bad, and we've got to root it out. And when we do, and when inflation comes back down, it will be completely transformative for how people feel about their situation.
Well, again, imagine the shock for the Prime Minister when he finds out that under the Conservative government, when inflation was just 2% in 2021, around 1 in 5 people in the UK were living in poverty.
Actually, we still have groups of people who are not doing that, and they're striking, and that is a reason that the waiting lists are going up. It's as simple as that. I just want to be honest with you. Yes, they are going up. That's the reason they're going up. It's not because we're not putting more money in or doing lots of different things, which no doubt we can talk about.
It's just shocking.
I supported Brexit, but I think that's the right thing to do, and I don't think that's the reason that some businesses are struggling at the moment.
Seriously?
Businesses say they feel like they're banging their heads against a brick wall over improving trade with the European Union. That's according to the British Chambers of Commerce, which says its members are still struggling with the UK's post-Brexit trading arrangements.
There were figures published just before Christmas, which you probably saw. Brexit has cost the government £40 billion a year in lost tax revenue. What, as a very leading businessman, what has the impact of Brexit been on business generally in the UK?
It's been catastrophic.
The Centre for Economic Reform claims the government has lost out on £40 billion in taxes because of the damage done to the country's output by leaving the European Union.
In fact, the actual OBR report the government is relying on says Brexit will result in the UK's trade intensity being a staggering 15% lower in the long run than if the UK had remained in the EU. The simple fact of the matter is that under the Conservative government, the UK has become the first country in history to actually impose trade barriers on itself.
Where would we prefer to have that energy come from? I'm pretty clear that it's better to have it from here at home. Why? Because it's better for our security, so we're not more reliant on foreign dictators like Vladimir Putin.
But again, imagine the Prime Minister's shock when he watches this.
And Rishi Sunak says rather than importing it from hostile states and playing into Vladimir Putin's hands, he wants more gas to come from Britain and claims this will bring down bills. Now, the UK is a net importer of gas, but even before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia provided just 4% of our gas in the UK. Most of our gas imports come from not very hostile Norway.
Your fifth promise was to stop the boats. I quote you directly, Prime Minister. When will they stop?
This is really important. We've just passed a new law in Parliament that no other government's done anything like it.
That would be the one which breaches a number of the UK's international legal obligations, including the European Convention on Human Rights and the Refugee Convention.